and a more inclusive urban space. I'm done.
Thank you, Dace, very much for this wonderful perspective into your own personal research, but also thank you very much for integrating a lot of the ideas that were said today into your short response. That was excellent and fits perfectly at the end of this session. I would like to invite everybody now to signal who has a question, a comment, idea they would like to share, to unmute, and the floor is open for everybody at this moment. Any questions? Any comments? Ideas that have remained untouched upon?
If I might say something very briefly, I was interested. It was something that I had noted from the second session this morning when it was Angela mentioned scale as a potential issue in relation to appropriation in the European city. And I thought that was also a very important topic in relation to the question of the integrative properties of the urban scene, because an awful lot of what has been written about it, at least in terms of kind of literature and poetics, relates largely to the kind of metropolis scenario. So I'd be very interested to hear people's views on what the implications of scale are for this kind of question, especially given the kind of medium-size city focus of the network.
Thank you, Michael. Does anybody have a response?
Yes, I'd like to respond. I think indeed, Michael, as you said, we had this discussion in the previous session about scale, and I think both Honorina and Adriana came with this scale of the neighborhood as one that is a scale in which you can somehow capture these local cultures, but also a scale in which appropriation takes place and which you can somehow study. I was in the current presentations today, there were in many links to projects. I mean, Matthew was showing this landscape project with the skate park and the watershed. There was Dace's project not shown but discussed about the Riga waterfront or harbor area. Isabella's projects about particular communities and particular urban neighborhoods. And then Juan also about these heritage neighborhoods where you actually moved in your imagery, Juan, to the details, the detail of the window, of the door opening. So maybe it's also about moving between these different scales, from the scale of the landscape to the scale of the detail and the neighborhood as a kind of central scale. It seems something, this neighborhood scale is something that came back in multiple discussions today. Another response maybe is that the lineup of this session was very interesting, to start from the landscape perspective to the literary, the arts, the heritage, and then the narrative, and shining a light on this notion of integration from different perspective. I think it was very, very enlightening.
Maybe I could just jump in briefly too. I think this question of scale really explicitly relates to some of the conversation we're having about rural and urban. What is the scale of self-representation, the scale of self-identification? I thought maybe just by way of picture saying 1,000 words, I just show you briefly this, which you might not have seen before, a diagram from Clough Williams, a very interesting text, The England and the Octopus, talking about the early expression of colonialism through urbanization. This sketch shows Mr. William Smith answers the call to preserve his native soil inviolate, and then he comes back after the war, and he comes back again to see how well he has done it. And this was the experience of many when they went off to war, including, of course, Ian McHarg talks about how he came back from the Second War and found that this had happened to his community in Scotland. And so I think what we need when we think of scale is agency in relation to what? In relation to neighborhood. I think you say right about neighborhood. I think it's about communities have their own identities. And so we should look at scale in relation to the various settlement patterns as we talk about. There's Desakota, there's Wissenstadt, there's the Città Diffusa, there's many different in-between modes. And I think scale should, I think this is very interesting. We end up between the community itself and the watershed. And I think this is basically like Elizabeth Markham, the wonderful rural sociologist, and her text, Ecological Boundaries as Community Boundaries. I think this, we can really take a clue from the landscape when it comes to scale.
With this question of scale, just to come back to Juan's presentation, and Dace's presentation, I thought this notion of storied matter was extremely interesting. And I felt that these images of the windows and the door opening and the threshold were actually these details that embody stories and rituals that have developed over centuries. So thank you, Dace, for bringing up that notion, storied matter.
Can I add something in terms of this scale question, because that's was already what you asked a little bit. So we talk about neighborhood scale, but that would still be the neighborhood scale is for any urban environment the same. But there's of course also a difference between a neighborhood in a metropolis and a neighborhood in a medium-sized city. And I was wondering how, I mean, it's also a difference in scale in, so what is so typical? I don't think we talked about that very much today. What is typical for medium-sized cities in relation to huge cities or tiny cities, in terms also of social fabric would be different. The relation to the landscape, surrounding landscape would be different. So there's also something specific when we talk about medium-sized cities that we haven't really addressed. And I don't know how to address it, but it should be, at least that question should be asked. So
Thank you, Saskia. Agreed, definitely. And also when talking about scale, it's not only a question of scale of integration, appropriation, we can also talk about the scale of meaningfulness, when something is meaningful on the individual level versus on a collective, much more broader level. So this is something we discussed in the afternoon session of our Working Group 2 meeting, but also of course, we can discuss it here further. I don't want to steer the discussion away from the term integration, but also all three notions need to be discussed. On which scale should we analyze them? Are there any more thoughts, comments, ideas?
Just perhaps one little comment on the idea of scale and about neighborhood. I think it refers back to what we've been talking in the morning, the idea of kind of virtual communities who do not have the scale of the neighborhood, but become global, but becoming effective in specific neighborhoods, and especially social media and internet have kind of made it a bit fuzzy to make the distinction between different scales, but also between different regions, because I'm talking to you from a relatively rural area. But thanks to internet and thanks to broadband, I can just communicate with people who are living in the center of a city, while only 30 years ago, they would be completely different situation. So I think that the communication and the massiveness of communication has forced us to rethink the notion of scale and belonging to a specific community, because I live now in a very rural village, but still I'm connected to the city, which in a way that was not before. So I think we have to be careful about, again, the oppositions, because again, they're relevant, but living in the countryside does not mean that you cannot be an urbanite at the same time. And I think the spread of conspiracy theories has shown it in a very clear way. We've all been hooked to our screens refreshing the American elections, while it has nothing to do with the scale of our neighborhood, but we're completely hooked and addicted to the color red and the color blue on screen. So it's very fascinating to see how something very global can affect every locality. So I think it's something to keep in the back of our mind, that we have to keep in mind this kind of virtual space.
Thank you, Chris. Klaske just texted me something. So Klaske, please feel free to take the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this notion of the mid-sized city, or why we chose for it, but I didn't want to steer the whole discussion on meaningfulness, integration, and appropriation away too much. But maybe just as an explanation, I think one of the points of departure is that you could say Europe is a continent that has this widely spread conglomeration of mid-sized cities. So the discussion on the metropole is not maybe so appropriate, to use a word that we used a lot today, for the European discussions on how we deal with our cities. We have only very few metropoles, but we have many medium-sized cities that are kind of regional centers in themselves. So I think that was also one of the reasons to stay a bit away from that much debated topic of the metropolis and move to a kind of urban condition that is much more present in Europe, and that's more overlooked. But maybe that's something for one of the next sessions of the working group, where we, or maybe also of the working group 4, where we will start discussing actually projects in these cities, how we define the mid-sized cities and how these projects are specific to these type of cities.
Maybe if I could just say a word about that also, just because it is very central to this notion of, you know, we wouldn't accept a structural engineer who says that they're only concerned about compression. Tension isn't their thing, you know. So it's the same if we talk about rural, urban. If we talk about mid-sized city, is it really a rural thing or an urban thing? And usually it's a little bit of both. So this is what I think it becomes very, very interesting to, as we talk about integration of distinct things, still recognizing what it is that makes them distinct, and pleasurably so. The contrast of an edge condition between rural and urban is very fascinating, fantastic spatial experience with a lot of richness of possibility. But in Cairo, when you see this edge condition between the city and the countryside, it's a little devastating, because you realize all that urbanization is happening in a very low density over the very only agricultural landscapes that exist in that whole nation. So this is a little bit where we talk about...
and perhaps it's the mid-sized city where this rural dimension or the connection to the countryside is much more prominent.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing we love about Rotterdam, right? Is we can be in the middle of the city in Rotterdam and you got a tractor driving by with the hay bales for the... It's just lovely. This is what we love, right? About Rotterdam.
Thank you very much. Are there any, Dacia, did you maybe wanted to add something?
Actually, I wanted to react to Chris' point on the virtual space and its relationship to integration and so on. So I don't think that we should think of virtual space as an exclusively globalizing phenomenon, because in my experience with 4 neighborhoods in Riga, I have found out that the virtual space can be also dividing or fragmenting mechanism, as these neighborhoods, they have their own Facebook groups, and not everyone is admitted to those groups. So in a way, this virtual space also serves for creating boundaries around the communities, not just linking them to the to bigger space and city as a whole.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was referring to. I can belong to a virtual network right now, while outside my neighbor is literally driving with his tractor, like Matthew says. So it's a different world because of this virtualization. So you need not a kind of global, we all think the same, but especially the kind of different communities that emerge through the so-called bubbles on the internet. So I'm completely agreeing with you, Dace.
Thank you. There's a comment from Sarah. Sarah, please.
Yes, just to say that, I think today we have been kind of categorizing things, and we have this need to put everything in a box, usually, and those researchers also. It's medium, it's metropolitan, it's private, it's public. So we always, even I was saying, is use or is appropriation. So we have this need to categorize things, and integration here, it's a way of thinking that, or a way of questioning that probably there are not these boundaries. So how can we blur these boundaries in categorizing and reading urban spaces? And probably the integration itself, it's already there, because urban systems are so complex and they have all the variety of things. That's why sometimes it's so difficult to categorize things and put into boxes. So this integration, or this concept of integration, is kind of a way of helping us to blur and find probably the integration that is already there in the urban systems. It's just to discover where is it. Well, I don't know if I make myself clear, but so it's a way of thinking also. Yeah.
Wonderful, Sarah. Thank you. It's a kind of a paradox. We need some kind of boundaries to distinguish between the terms, but we also need to incorporate all of them into our research. So it's a very interesting paradox. Are there any more comments and ideas? Or would you like to have a break? We have an aperitif break planned, so we hope to see everybody back with a glass of wine. It's 5 in the afternoon. It's a wonderful time to relax, to have the unofficial part of our mini conference, and just to chat informally. That would be wonderful to see everybody in the same room. Unfortunately, we'll have to make do with what we have. So if you agree, we would like to see everybody back here at 5 o'clock sharp for an unofficial closing and exchange of more ideas if you feel the need. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Then see you in a half an hour.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. Bye.